Welcome. My name is Bob Pianta, Dean of the School of Education and Human Development here at the University of Virginia. Thank you for joining today's conversation about an issue that affects communities across the United States and the world: inequitable access to the internet. Most Americans can access the internet at home and rely on that access for all aspects of daily life: work, recreation, relationships, commerce, and education. Yet the US tolerates a profound digital divide. Many households in low-income urban and rural areas, and communities of color in particular, lack basic internet access, and millions more have access that fails to meet today's standards. The consequences for tens of millions of American students from preschool to college are profound, with second graders and second years sitting in parking lots to access math instruction. This problem is not new. The digital divide was documented in 1995, and for years, leaders highlighted the homework gap, a lack of household internet access preventing 16 million children from fully engaging in their education even before the pandemic hit. Then school changed overnight in March 2020 when in-person schooling stopped and all students, educators, and parents had to do school online. The pandemic illuminated the realities and equities of the digital divide. The homework gap is now an education gap, with countless students, many from low-income families or of color, lacking the most basic tool needed to connect with the educational process. Today, we're fortunate to bring together leaders uniquely positioned to chart a path forward on this tremendous challenge. Larry Irving, who is the CEO of the Irving Group, led the first empirical study to document the digital divide. As Assistant Secretary of Commerce and NTIA Administrator during the Clinton administration, Mr. Irving helped establish some of the foundational US domestic internet policies, and his research has supported legislation to address the digital divide. US Congresswoman Grace Meng represents the 6th Congressional District of New York and serves on the House Appropriations Committee. She supports causes from child safety and religious freedom to veterans initiatives, and has led the House legislative effort to address the digital divide during the pandemic. Congresswoman Meng was pulled into a recently scheduled committee meeting and hopes to join us during today's session. FCC Acting Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel is a champion for accessibility and affordability in communication services so that all Americans get a fair shot at success in the digital age. From protecting net neutrality to spearheading efforts to solve the homework gap, she has shaped policies to expand broadband access to schools, libraries, hospitals, and households across the country. Today's session will be moderated by James Ryan, the 9th president of the University of Virginia. He was previously a distinguished professor at the UVA School of Law, is a leading expert on law and education, and writes about the ways in which law structures educational opportunity. Prior to his appointment as UVA's president, Mr. Ryan served as the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Please post questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature of Zoom. We will address as many as we can during the latter portion of the hour. And I also want to thank our partners in the Office of Engagement, the Miller Center, and the Office of the President. Thank you again for joining us. And I will now hand the microphone to my colleague and friend, UVA President Jim Ryan, and invite our panelists to join.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to have you all here, if virtually. I'm sorry we're not together in person, but I'm glad that we can be together on Zoom. I'd like to begin by thanking Bob Pianta, Matthew Wheelock, and the teams at the School of Education and Human Development and the university's Office of Engagement for putting together this important conversation. And I'd like to offer a special welcome and thanks to our panelists, Mr. Larry Irving, Congresswoman Grace Meng, and Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. We really appreciate your spending time with us. So, as we all know, this pandemic has shone a light on, and in some instances exacerbated existing disparities, many of them related to race or income or wealth or geography. And a lot of these are connected to health, obviously, but the digital divide is another example. And it's one that we saw here at UVA when we sent students home last spring and moved all classes online. It became quickly apparent to us that some students were going to be disadvantaged by that and struggle more than others, in part because of lack of access to broadband internet or internet at all. Our colleagues across the university scrambled and did heroic things to provide assistance to probably 2,500 students, but we still know that some struggled. That said, our challenge was a drop in the bucket compared to the challenges elsewhere in higher education, and particularly the challenges facing K-12 education. So we're here to talk about the digital divide and what might be done about it. But before we get to today, I want to start at the beginning because and ask you, Mr. Irving, because you were there at the beginning in many ways. The digital divide is not new. You wrote about it a quarter of a century ago in 1995, and I'm curious what facts or problems really worried you back then, and what facts or problems worry you now or keep you up at night now?
Thank you, President Ryan. It's an honor to be here. And before I start, I have to commend my good friend, the new acting chair of the FCC, Chair Rosenworcel. And I do want to say hello to Congressman Meng, who I haven't met, but I am a native of Queens. And really, everything that I've done on Digital Divide goes back to kind of my grounding in Queens. If you think about 1993, 94, 95, the internet was brand new. When I joined the Clinton administration, there were 15 million people on the internet. By 95, when we started the reports, there might have been 100 million. Ron Brown, another New Yorker, and I went out to Silicon Valley. Now, I graduated from Stanford Law School, so I was familiar with the Valley, and I was out there. We went to Cupertino, went to this wonderful little junior high school, and these beautiful kids were sitting 8 to a table around some networked iMacs. And I said, this is the future. And then Secretary Brown and I went to Thurgood Marshall High School, which is in Hunters Point, San Francisco. And most of the kids there are free reduced lunch, predominantly Black, predominantly Asian, Asian immigrant, predominantly Latino. Those who the kids were. And those kids had no idea that technology existed. And so I'm a graduate of PS 118 in Queens and Junior High School 67, which I think may be in the Congresswoman's district. And I went back to my school. I went to my senior high school about 2 weeks later, Springfield Gardens High School, which doesn't exist anymore. And the only technology those kids in that school saw was a metal detector to make sure they didn't have a knife or a gun when they're coming to the school. So you see one group of kids who are sitting around a computer and they're the future, and another group of kids who have no idea that this technology exists, and they have no idea of how the internet's going to impact them. So if I'm looking at today, if I go back to PS 118, most of those kids in the neighborhood I grew up in, Hollis, Queens, are still free reduced lunch. A year ago, before the pandemic, 43% of those kids were a year or more behind in either math or reading or both. And now the majority of those kids don't have access to the internet. And majority of them were lost in April, May, June of last year when the congressman was doing this work and when Chairwoman Rosenworth was doing her work to try to connect those kids. So we took a problem that was already existed and we made it worse. We talk about the digital divide, and I've started talking about it in terms of digital affluence and digital poverty. Because if you're connected as we are, you have all of the tools in the world. But if you're on the other side of the digital divide, if you're digitally impoverished, you really can't compete. And so now we're seeing learning loss, and we're seeing these kids in a deeper hole than they were, and they were already in a hole. I grew up to be an assistant secretary of commerce, to work for President of the United States, to be on boards of corporations. And I'm worried that kids who are at least as smart as I am and have more talent won't have the opportunity, not because of their capacity, because we didn't give them the tools to succeed.
So, Mr. Irving, do you think, and I think I know the answer to this, are we on the right path as a country in solving this problem?
I feel a lot better now than I did before January 20th, or maybe I should say back in November, because I do think that I'll say this, and I'm not trying to over politicize it, but one of the problems that we've seen over the last 4 years, the digital divide has increasingly been seen by some as a rural urban problem. I've done this for a long time. And there are a lot of things that factor into when you're not, if your English is second language is a problem. If you're elderly, it's a problem. If you're an immigrant, it's a problem. If you're rural, it's a problem. If you're in the inner city, it's a problem. But if you add poverty to any of that, that's the major problem. And we've been fighting the wrong battle. We've been fighting the rural battle instead of fighting the poverty battle. If we really want to be serious about this, we have to make sure that everyone is connected. And I looked yesterday, Madam Chair of the FCC released the first 10 things she's done. And I know that I've heard that Congresswoman Meng is going to have a new bill with my other favorite person in Congress, Senator Markey, who I worked for 6 years. So there's a lot of connections on this. Everything I learned about telecom, I learned from Ed Markey. But I know that looking at the agenda that the new FC chair has laid out, we're now finally on the right path of thinking what we need to do with regard to E-rate, what we need to do with regard to distance learning, we need to do with regard to telehealth. We have the tools. It just comes down to the will and the wallet. And we've never had the will, and we weren't willing to open our wallet. I think we finally have crossed that Rubicon, and we're moving in the right direction.
Well, thanks. And that's a great lead into some questions for Chairwoman Rosenworcel. So you have used the platform of the FCC to talk about the homework gap for years. And building on what Mr. Irving was saying, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that gap concerns you, and whether it's just about homework or if it's about more than that. And then I'd like to talk to you about the E-rate.
Sure. First of all, thank you to the University of Virginia for holding this. And it's a treat to be here with two dynamos, Larry Irving, who's talked about this so passionately for so long, and Congresswoman Meng, who is leading the charge in the House of Representatives on these issues. So you really have an amazing crew here. So the way that I came to this issue, actually, it does involve E-rate. When I first got to the FCC, you do the things that you do when you get to a new job and you're at the helm of a new institution. You start surveying the programs. And I was familiar with E-rate, which is the nation's largest education technology program. And since the late 90s, it has helped connect classrooms in schools in every state in this country to the internet. So it's been this quiet powerhouse doing good work. But instead of just looking at it in Washington, I decided to go on the road back when we did those things. And I visited rural schools in Colorado and urban schools in Philadelphia, suburban schools in Virginia, and exurban schools in California. And what amazed me is those places were so different, but I heard the same thing from educators everywhere. The E-rate program was great. It brought the internet to their classrooms. They could teach with this new tool. But when they assigned homework at night, they couldn't be confident that every student had access. And I was hearing the same stories in rural America and urban America. And in a nation where there's so much that divides us, I just kept on hearing the same stories everywhere. And this digital divide where these kids get access at school, but then go home at night and can't complete their schoolwork, to me, it needed a new name. So we started looking at the data, and we found that 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access, but 1 in 3 students, according to the FCC, or 1 in 3 households, according to the FCC, don't have broadband. And so where those numbers overlap, we started calling it the homework gap. And this was something that we championed for a long time. It needed attention as a matter of educational equity. And then the pandemic hit, right? We sent 50 million kids home. And those kids who fell into the homework gap were locked out of the virtual classroom. And you know who they are. They're disproportionately rural, Black, Brown, Latino, Indigenous. We've got to figure out a way to get them out. There are studies that suggest 16 to 17 million kids fall into the homework gap. And we see them now in urban America and rural America. Maybe you saw that picture that went viral this summer of those 2 little girls sitting outside of Taco Bell, with the school-issued laptops on their knees. They weren't there for lunch. They were trying to get a free wireless signal to go to class. And now what I think we need to do is take that E-rate program that connects schools and use it to connect every student at home.
So for those in the audience who might not know about the E-rate program, I wonder if you could just describe it a bit and talk a little bit about how it could be extended to the home.
Sure. So E-rate is a byproduct of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which turns 25 years old next week. Actually, it was signed into law. Yeah, that was a long time ago. I mean, that was when we had dial-up internet, with that hiss and buzz. Yeah. I had an AOL account. I was proud of it, right? It was a really long time ago. But Congress was ahead of the curve when it came to education and technology. It saw that this information superhighway was going to have new teaching potential. And so it set up a program to make sure every school in this country and library could get internet access. And it was done on a sliding scale. So schools in rural areas and schools with more students on free and reduced lunch programs would get greater amounts of support. And over time, we connected schools, we connected classrooms, we made it possible to do a lot of neat things when kids go to the physical school building. But as this pandemic has demonstrated, sometimes school is going to take place at home. Though some kids can't do that internet access at home and do their schoolwork and fully participate in class. So what I'd like to see is that we update the E-rate program to meet this moment. So schools not only get connectivity that comes to their class, but they can do things like loan wireless hotspots out of the school library. And if you think about it, doing something that small is the difference between keeping up in class and falling behind. And we should look at other solutions too. We should think about Wi-Fi on wheels, so school buses in rural areas. When kids get back to school, we can turn ride time into connected time for homework. We should look about what the city of Chicago is doing in the state of North Dakota, where they're blanketing communities with broadband to make sure every student is connected at home. You know, we used to have No Child Left Behind. I think right now we need No Child Left Offline. And we're going to have to figure out how to have policies in Congress and at the FCC to make it happen, because I think this is the moment.
So I think that is a winning slogan, No Child Left Offline. Thank you very much. So Congresswoman Meng, first of all, welcome. Thanks for being with us. And you have, as Bob mentioned in the introduction, you have been a champion of updating and expanding the E-rate in Congress. And I wonder, first of all, why did you pick this issue?
Yeah, thank you, President Ryan and University of Virginia for hosting this really meaningful discussion today. Thank you to our acting chairwoman, Rosenworcel, for your tremendous, oh my gosh, friendship, mentorship, guidance, just caring enough. Even before the pandemic, we actually had these conversations, caring enough about the lives of our children all over America, to just be such a leader on this issue. To Administrator Irving, I did not know you were from Queens. My son actually attends 67, the middle school that you attended. And so this is just, what a small world, and how proud we are here in Queens. As you see, my virtual background is the globe that represents Queens. But I'll be honest, I'm a congresswoman from a relatively urban area. And I did not expect when I went to Congress that I would be prioritizing this issue. But I will say that in my capacity as a congresswoman and in my work with the Democratic National Party, I've been able to travel around the country quite a bit. I've been to rural areas that I never expected to visit, and I heard more stories than I ever expected from folks who tell me that they don't have access to the internet on a regular basis, that they can't access news, that their kids can't access homework. And then what I saw more clearly than ever, that there were many communities of color in these rural communities, and it was more of an intersection than I ever had anticipated. And I just really thought, as a parent who has noticed the great difference between when I went to school and how my kids are attending school now. I remember asking my son, maybe second or third grade, I said, "Show me your textbooks." And they laughed. They're like, "What textbooks? We don't have textbooks. It's all online." We were fortunate to have some level of internet service for, most of their days when they needed to access the internet. But I kept thinking, what if you were a parent? What if you were a student who had no access to the internet? How can we have all these complex discussions about equitable access to education and opportunity when we're not even providing what I believe is really the human right, a human right in this day and age, just like electricity, just like clean water. how can we not? And I love that slogan, Commissioner. I mean, you know, Chairwoman, let's make T-shirts of this. No child should be left offline. And then I was fortunate because I got to work with Mr. Jim Clyburn, who is a rep from South Carolina, but who was also our majority whip in Congress. And he kind of took me under his wing, and he had started in 2019 a rural broadband task force, brought together members from all over the country, mostly from rural areas, plus me, right? So I learned so much from Mr. Clyburn and from my colleagues, and to hear what so many of their constituents have gone through, and this homework gap that should not be the norm for American families. And so, you know, primarily that's sort of how I got into this, by witnessing what families were going through around the country, and then hearing stories from everyday Americans, regardless of your ethnic or economic background, and what people were going through. And so, you know, we live in the world's richest nation, but millions of people, many of them are students who were trying to educate, can't even connect to the internet, can't even do their homework. And so that's just not okay in the United States of America. And that's why I've made it such a priority. And I will say that when I joined the task force and when I started working on this issue, you know, friends and colleagues and even the media in New York City were kind of confused. You know, why are you taking on this issue? You live in an urban area. But I will say, I remember quoting a report from our city controller that 30% of New York City kids don't have access to the internet pre-pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, and Chairwoman Rosenworcel probably saw this as we were working in Congress on our legislation, there's so much more interest, so much more motivation, interest in working on this issue, because all of a sudden, every representative in Congress understood what the homework gap and the digital divide meant, regardless of what type of district you represented. And so I really believe that we have an inherent duty to make sure that our students, that our kids, our leaders have the tools that they need to succeed. And it won't happen if they don't have access to the internet. So that's my story.
Well said. So I would like to just ask you quickly about the politics of this, because I'm naive when it comes to understanding politics, to be honest. But this seems like almost like an apple pie kind of issue. I would think it would have bipartisan support. But the first time the federal funding, there was a proposal for federal funding of this, but didn't make it into the final act. Are you optimistic that Congress will act on this issue?
I am optimistic, and I do not want to pretend that I am any less naive or can predict politics any more than you can, Mr. President.
Okay, that worries me a little.
Especially in this day and age. Look, negotiations are tough. I was personally really disappointed when the E-rate program was not included in December's COVID bill package. We had worked with so many of our colleagues. I know that our leaders, you know, from Speaker Pelosi to now Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and especially to Chairman Pallone of our Energy Committee, was very, you know, really prioritized this issue. And we probably talked almost at every caucus meeting about this specific issue. But, you know, right now we are in a different administration. I am very hopeful we continue to push. And one thing I've learned in Congress is that nothing is predictable, and you might not know exactly when something might happen. It might happen when you're least expecting it. So we will continue to push. We are hopeful that whether it's through a budget reconciliation process, a resolution, or a bipartisan COVID deal, that we can get something through. So we still maintain hope.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. So just to remind people in the audience, you can post questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now I'm going to open it up to all the panelists. So you, any one of you can answer these questions, and then I'll turn to some audience questions. One thing I've wondered about is how much of this is an infrastructure problem? And I mean, do we have the capacity? And so it's a question of, I understand the E-rate program is more of a discount in terms of the cost of the services, but do we need more infrastructure, especially in rural areas, or do we have the infrastructure that we need?
Here, I'll take this. I think Larry touched on this earlier, but I just want to reiterate some of the points he made. When we talk about our nation's digital divide, we got to be really important to recognize we got two sets of problems. The first is deployment. We've got some rural areas in this country where networks don't reach. Yeah. And we're going to have to make sure that we extend those facilities. But we have this second problem, and candidly, I think the last administration just ignored it, which is that we have 3 to 4 times as many people in urban and suburban areas that don't have internet access consistently and reliably at home. A lot of that has to do with affordability. Right. So we never solve the digital divide if we don't deal with those two things. And by the way, that's why it is so important that Congresswoman Meng joined the Rural Broadband Caucus. You might not have thought that Queens, New York needed a representative there, but what is powerful about that is realizing we got to solve both of these problems if we want to solve the digital divide. We can't ignore one and just solve the other.
Everything that the chairwoman said is absolutely right. But what happens is we look at one problem, rural, and that's got a high price tag to get those 5% of households that aren't connected. It is going to be expensive. There is a reason they're not connected. Those folks want to be connected. Their state public utility commissioners, their members of Congress want them connected. And candidly, I think the chairwoman and the congresswoman and I want them connected as well. We know that every American benefits when every American is connected. It is less expensive per capita or per household, but also expensive to connect the 20 to 30 million American households who can't afford internet access. Oh. And then the question is, do we do it on a per month basis so that I helped write Lifeline back in the 80s working for Congressman Mickey Leland, and I helped develop E-rate in the 90s working for President Clinton. So the two biggest programs that help low-income people, Lifeline and E-rate, are things that are near and dear to my heart. But I also want to make sure that as we're spending money, we're spending it smart and we're spending it focused. So when we're doing the rural area, we need to make sure, and this is something that the chairwoman's been focused on, that the mapping is done in the right order. You don't do ready, fire, aim. You make sure you know what areas need and how much is needed to be spent before you spend money on deployment in rural areas. The last administration didn't quite get that right. But the second thing you need to do is make sure that when we're doing urban areas, that we're not just spending money every month that isn't appreciably helping those folks going forward. So I want to connect people now. There's a short-term problem connecting people now and a longer-term problem making sure that there's an affordable way of keeping them connected in the future.
And I wanted to add also, President Ryan, the legislation that I'm working on with Senator Markey, who we've heard lots about today, who's just been a super champion in the Senate, is part of an overall rural broadband bill that would invest about $100 billion into this very infrastructure to build high-speed broadband infrastructure in unserved and underrepresented communities. And, just yesterday, Mr. Clyburn was saying on one of our caucus meetings that as we are talking with the Biden administration about infrastructure, with the last administration, it was infrastructure week for 4 years. And so I hope we can finally see it come to fruition, but we absolutely have to include this topic as we're talking about infrastructure bills.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I said it seems sort of apple pie. It does seem like it becomes as critical as any other piece of infrastructure. But I think you've cleared up a misconception, certainly on my part, about what the digital divide is. I think for a lot of people, they're thinking it's rural areas that don't actually have infrastructure and not thinking about the affordability. So I'm glad to be educated on that piece. I want to turn to a question from the audience about access versus use. So we've been talking mostly about access, but the question is, how do we also move the digital access divide to address the digital use divide? How do we ensure students are having equitable and rich learning experiences rather than just having screen time?
I'll start on that. You know, when we first started back in the 90s, we first started connecting schools and libraries. And one of the things that was incredibly important was making sure we had content that was relevant to communities that would bring people in. And we also did digital literacy, because as we're learning from social media and otherwise, how to process what you see online, how to think about what's seeing online, what's good information, what's bad information. That's not necessarily endemic to all of us. We have to make sure our children have those kinds of skills. We can't just put technology. Technology is a tool, but it's not the solution. And we do need digital literacy. We do need digital use. But most schools now have a pretty good sense of what's working. But the one thing I want to challenge some of the academicians on this call and otherwhere and whoever, and later to think about. We have a lot of information over the last 16, 18 months about what's happening in schools, what the results are. Pedagogy has changed. I'm on a board of trustees of a university. I talk to professors and they tell me that how they're thinking about teaching using this device versus an in-class learning is a completely different experience. Are we cataloging that? Are we taking the lessons learned? When we first connected schools and libraries and hospitals, museums, one of the things we did in the Clinton administration is make sure that we collected those lessons learned, that every teacher could learn from other teachers about what was working and what wasn't. And what worries me is there's a lot of really smart people doing some really good things with regard to distance education and remote learning. Where's the repository of that learning?
Yeah.
How are we disseminating that? And if we don't do that right, we'll have spent billions of dollars and not gotten the full benefit of those billions of dollars.
Right. Well, I'm hoping Bob Pianta is listening, because I think that seems like a great project for the School of Education and Human Development here at UVA. Congresswoman, did you want to add?
I'm going to jump in just on that one, Jim. So, sorry to interrupt, but it's a fantastic question. The School of Education is actually working nationally to try to pair educators using technology all across the country and pulling the information about lessons learned and creating actually a national exchange where those lessons can be shared. It's the Education Technology Efficacy Exchange, and we'll be glad to tell you more about it.
Christmas in February. Thank you.
I know, Mr. Irving, you teed that up perfectly. It's like you guys maybe arranged that before, but that was well done. Congresswoman Meng, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I did want to add that also included in Mr. Clyburn's overall broadband bill, this is the magic bill, the answer to everything. It also has potential grant programs which will help address some of these gaps in learning digital skills, programs that we can collaborate with local individuals and schools and programs. So on a local level, those are two examples of programs that could be very helpful in increasing the actual use of broadband.
So I want to turn to another question. An audience member would like to know the best strategies for getting E-rate as part of local budgets.
Well, this is complex, a little weedy, but the way the E-rate program works is most states, they develop consortia and they apply and they bid out connectivity to schools and libraries in a district or group of districts. And then generally the lowest bid is the one that often gets funded. And so there's a lot of work that's done through state E-rate coordinators, state education technology directors, and district education technology directors. It's different in different communities, but it is often done with communities working together because they recognize that when these networks work together, they tend to be more efficient and more cost effective.
Great. So we're talking primarily about education, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the importance of broadband access to the economy more generally and to employment, because we're not only looking at students learning from home, but people working from home. And so I wonder if you can talk just briefly about the digital divide in the world of work.
I mean, I'll start, and the Congresswoman and I are both from Queens, and Queens is blue collar personified. So many of the people that she represents, my dad worked for Con Edison. My mom was a social worker. They didn't have they didn't have jobs where they could do them using Zoom. And so when you think about what happened in the pandemic, the reason that Ground Central was Queens, New York, because those are the bus drivers and the people who take the tokens and the folks who work at the Pathmark, and they were in front of other people every day. When you look at Black and brown workers in America, they are underrepresented in terms of people who use Zoom for work. I'm an anomaly in my own family as somebody who actually does my work over this computer. Most of the people in my family still get up every morning, put on their shoes, put on their coat, and go out to work.
Right.
A lot of that has to do with access to technology. They don't have the broadband technology, they can't afford it, and their jobs don't allow them to do it from home. It has been a wonderful thing. When you look at the numbers from Zoom went from, I think, 100 billion impressions to 2 billion impressions in a month and a half. I mean, when you started looking at how fast Zoom went up, but it wasn't equitably distributed, and that has to do with the manner of work and connectivity. So we do have to rethink that. But there's also another problem. The New York City Chief Technology Office, and I'm using New York because I know these statistics, 40% of small businesses in New York weren't connected to a gig network, a gigabit network, which is a fast line.
Right.
Disproportionately Black, brown, and immigrants who weren't connected. So the small mom and pop. So if my mom lives in Fredericksburg, Virginia, her favorite bakery is Paul's Bakery. When Paul's Bakery closed its doors for customers, they could go online and we could still order. When Pablo's Taqueria or DeQuan's Barbershop closes, they don't have that capacity. So the economic impact on communities of color, of small businesses, of people who are trying to make a living is huge because of lack of access to technology. And then one last piece, and the chairwoman will appreciate it because it's personal to us. We both have a friend who's a former FCC commissioner who's alive today because of the internet. Because he got on the internet and talked to his doctor. He had a concierge doctor, and she looked at him and said, "Look at you right now. You may have COVID. Get to the hospital." He went to the hospital twice, but he lived. Think of the number of people we all know don't have the capacity, either don't have a doctor who knows them that well, or if they do have that doctor, they don't have the capacity to a high bandwidth connection with doctor can look at them in the face and say, "Looking at you, you're a little green around the gills, get your butt to a hospital." That matters too. And how many lives I'm glad we're saving some lives, but how many lives do we lose?
Yeah, right. Well, it gets to a point that Congresswoman Meng was mentioning earlier, which is, this pandemic has both made us realize what is possible to do online in ways that we wouldn't have realized before, but that also makes it more apparent why it's so important for everyone to have access to the internet. So Chairwoman Rosenworcel, I want to hear your views about the world of work and.
Yeah. Well, we're doing a radically higher number of things online than we did before. We're having a nationwide experiment. So I love how Larry suggested we should be studying what works for education, but I actually think it's not limited to education. We should be studying what works for healthcare. I spent time this week with Dr. Rubin from the University of Virginia, who does telemedicine there, and also the Whitman Walker Clinic, Children's Hospital. And they're telling some really inspired stories. They've never been forced to move online like this, but they got all their practitioners to do it. And it turns out that behavioral health therapy works better when someone's sitting at home. They feel more comfortable. Right. There are appointments that they have had difficulty keeping with certain populations that contribute to things like our absolutely criminal maternal mortality rates. Well, guess what? When they set people up at home with pulse oximeters and regular video visits, they can make a meaningful difference in the healthcare of a mother and her child. And then there are issues with language as a barrier. And during the COVID days, only one patient can come in properly masked. But if they can actually check in with that patient at home, they could have someone sitting next to them who might be able to translate and write down with perfect accuracy exactly what the instructions are. And I realize that's not about education, but they're the kind of narratives that are telling us we're starting to understand what's possible. and how we can reach some communities who've been left behind. So it just means right now we've got to reset and double down on how we connect everyone. I loved how the Congresswoman said, you know, like electricity, like water, we got to connect 100% of us, you know, 100% of us, because all those things in healthcare, education, and the future of work become possible when we do.
Right. I'm curious. This is based on a question from a member of the audience. We've talked about the legislation in Congress. Is there a role for philanthropy or public-private partnerships in this space, or is this something really that is the job of the government, the federal government in particular?
I'm going to start, and I'll be a little controversial because I often am. It's the job of the federal government. And I say that early this week, one of the major telecommunications companies announced that they were going to change a policy they had and improve it, upgrade a policy they had with regard to providing broadband to people at home. We're going to give them faster speeds, and then we're going to make it a little easier to get access. And I'm heartened that they did that. But we shouldn't have to rely on eleemosynary or philanthropic efforts to connect our citizens. If somebody said, well, you can only get water if your water company decides they're going to have a special program because of your low income, or your lights are going to go off unless there's a special program because the electricity company decides. That's not the way we've run any other essential service in this country throughout its history. And it's not the way we should treat broadband. The one thing we do know is broadband has never been more important, and it'll never be less important than it is today. All of the things we're looking at, we're only going to see more dependence on broadband. So I am glad to see that some companies have stepped up, and we do need companies leaning forward, and we do want philanthropic efforts, and that matters. But at the end of the day, the responsibility has to be with the state and local and federal governments to make sure that people have the basic needs that all of us have, that every family has, to connect to loved ones, to connect to our jobs, to get educated, to get political information, to take care of our health care. Those are the things that matter. One last thing we haven't talked about, 27% of American senior citizens aren't connected to broadband. 27%, 1 in 4. And when you add a lens of poverty to that, you're getting close to half of impoverished senior citizens don't have home broadband, with a disease out there that's killing senior citizens.
Right.
This is something we have to do. The Michigan State Supreme Court Justice and I were on a panel like this, and she was talking about how they're delivering legal services to the poor, to the indigent, over the internet. But sometimes they've got to go to a community center or meet them in a park with a cell phone to do that. That is not the way this country should be acting. These issues are too important.
So I just want to build on what Larry said to your question, President Ryan. I think generosity is good, but justice is better. And in a just society, we decide that every student and every household should have a reliable, consistent internet connection. We need to make that a national policy, a state policy, and a local policy, because when we do that at every level, we'll be able to deliver. I'm not saying it's going to be fast or easy, but we need to be that clear that we're not just relying on generosity here. It's a matter of justice and making sure everybody has a fair shot.
Someone asks, and this is a great question. I'm curious about this as well. What are some experiences in other countries? Are there any models that we should be trying to follow in terms of universal access?
I don't know that anybody's gotten it completely right. I work closely with the ITU. The woman, Doreen Bogdan, who is head of the Broadband Development Committee of the ITU, is a former NTIA. She used to work with me in the Clinton administration. I know that, the broadband group there is trying to do wonderful things. I don't know that, whether you're looking at the United Kingdom, or if you're looking at France, you're looking at Europe, if you're looking at Africa, we're still looking at 1 in 3 people don't have access. There are still 3 billion people on the planet who are not connected to the internet out of 7 billion people on the planet. And what's the through line? Poverty. The unfortunate reality is wherever there are poor people who aren't online. Now that's the bad news. The good news is that if you looked at where the world was, when I left government in 1999, 2000, half the world had never used a telephone, half the world live 2 or more hours travel time from the nearest telephone. Telephones are now ubiquitous, and most folks on the planet now have access to a telephone. We're beginning to get access to the internet, but if you're poor, in most places on the planet, there is still a problem getting you connected to broadband internet.
So I'm going to pick up on some of the questions and ask them from a slightly different way. Is the cause for increased access to the internet hurt by some of the deleterious effects of being online and some of the toxicity of social media, right? I mean, on the one hand, you can see that it's a very useful thing when you think about telemedicine and all the opportunities. But I wonder, is the conversation influenced at all by the fact that, boy, it's sometimes being on the internet is a bad place to be?
I think it's just hard now. I mean, this is just my personal perspective. We don't feel like we have a lot of choices right now. You know, many people are quarantined at home, and whether we are using the internet for access to education, doctor's appointments, mental health check-ins, even getting vaccines, which is how most New Yorkers at least have to go through to get vaccine appointments. We don't necessarily have a choice. I can say that myself as a parent of 2 tween boys, it's hard, you know, I can't say no internet because they're in school on the internet. I can't turn it off. So I think when things return to normal times, I hope to be able to more responsibly and effectively regulate their access and their usage. But it's just really hard until we get out of this global pandemic right now.
Can I answer the question slightly differently?
Sure.
The reason that we still have the problems with regard to funding E-rate and the opposition to Lifeline and the opposition to so many programs that would help low-income people is ideological. I've been fighting these battles since 1994, 95. In 1999, before the Energy and Commerce Committee, I said that this would be the civil rights and economic rights issue of the next decade. I did not know it would be the next 2.5 decades when I said that in July of 1999. And if you look back at the E-rate was opposed by some on ideological grounds, was seen as the Gore tax. When we first started doing the trying to connect people to the internet through the E-rate, Al Gore, who was the vice president at the time, was, you know, let's be candid, he was a cosmic nerd. He really liked this stuff and it was his thing and the whole world knew it. And folks who weren't quite leaning into the internet at 95, 96, like, this is just Al Gore's thing. Why are we spending billions of dollars for his thing? And that's just hardened and concretized. Some industry folks opposed it because they thought that it would mean, you know, the public would push out private investment. And some ideologically proposed it, saying it's going to be another entitlement program that we can't afford. Right. But the reality is we can't afford not to connect our people. And so we've got to get past that ideology. I spent as much time in Howell Rogers District in Kentucky, Pikesville, Boonesboro, Whitesboro, which is the poorest Republican district in the country. These are former coal miner kids. You look in the eyes of those kids, you love them as much as you could love a kid from Brooklyn where I was born or Queens. And Howell Rogers was always supportive of almost everything I did, but trying to get other members to see that this was about every child in America and not just an inner city kid has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And I'm not sure I've succeeded 25 years later.
So we're getting close to the end of the hour, and there have been a number of questions on the same theme of what can we as individuals do to help? I mean, I completely take the point that this is a problem of a magnitude that it ought to be addressed by the government. But some are wondering, in the meanwhile, what's the best way to help? Is it a question of writing to your representatives? But is there something they could do at the local level?
You know, I think the answer is all of the above. You don't get things done and change policy without making noise and without making a ruckus. I can tell you that there's legislation that's being discussed on Capitol Hill that's exciting. I'll also point out that the Federal Communications Commission on Monday started a request for comment from the public on petitions from Nevada, the Colorado Attorney General, the national school boards, and a whole host of others who want to see the FCC update E-rate to address the homework gap and get kids connected. So public participation in that docket is great, including from university students. But I also think one of the most effective things that can happen involves counting. Every school district that starts to assess who's connected, who's not connected, will help us understand the size and shape of this problem. And it is not traditionally been something that educators have to think about. But when you think about equitable access to learning, it's become apparent during this pandemic that getting every child connected is necessary. So learning even from school districts, who's connected, who's not, making a map in a school district of where free Wi-Fi services are available so that students can get online is helpful. There's a little town in Iowa I visited a while ago, pre-pandemic days, where they decided they had an internet problem. They couldn't get every child connected. So they went to every storefront and asked if they had Wi-Fi service. And would they be willing to put a decal in the storefront window that said, hey, we're a safe space for homework. And so just imagine the students in that small community. Those decals started multiplying around town. It wasn't just the library and town hall, it was coffee shops and the insurance agent, and they were all basically telegraphing to their community and their students that we care about you and we care about your success. So there are some low-tech ways for making this a priority, and communities that invest in them, I think, are going to be the first to solve this problem.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thanks for sharing it.
We're having conversations on the nation about how do we leverage the existing investment we have. I live here in Washington, D.C., and down the street from me is a bilingual school. A lot of the kids there live on my block and they have a gig network, but just across town, some of those kids don't have anything at home and others are on a reduced bandwidth. If we can find some ways to use the investment made in our schools and our libraries, and I know the chairwoman is working on this, how do we leverage the already investment in schools and libraries so that they can be hotspots and so we can get these technologies out beyond? How do we do things with regard, there's a $285 million that's going to Black, Hispanic serving and tribal colleges, most of which are around communities they serve. How do we leverage those investments into those schools so they can better serve those communities? NTIA's got a program that's going to work on that. If you're a senior citizen, if you're a young person, you can help tutor a senior citizen how to use this. If you're a senior citizen has some outdated technology, donate it to almost every community has folks who are using refurbished technology. And if you're a thinker, how do we use these devices and these devices, iPads and iPhones, which are 10, 15 years old now, make them education devices. We've never really invested the time, money, and energy and more people have access to this than have access to the laptop I'm looking at you on. There are so many ways. Be creative, be thoughtful, lean into this problem because it matters. It matters to your community. It matters to our nation.
And I would say that we really there is momentum right now. We have it because we're in a pandemic, which is unfortunate, but because of that, more people than ever understand the importance of internet access and what it means for everyday Americans. And so, of course, President Ryan, they should continue to contact their elected officials at all levels of government. Yes, we have pending legislation at the federal level, but we want to make sure that our city and our state elected officials also know that it's important to them. And telling stories, as with almost any issue, I think the personal stories, however we can help create that visual and that narrative in people's mind is important. People might not realize that it's not just a family sitting in a rural area, a part of America somewhere. It's also a kid who might be sitting in the stairwell of an apartment building in an urban area. It's a kid who goes to work with his parents at the local Chinese takeout restaurant trying to do his homework in the back. It's a senior citizen who's trying to access healthcare or connecting with her family on the internet. These are stories that we just haven't seen and heard enough of in America, and they're very compelling. They're very sympathetic, and we have such a moment right now where we can take advantage of the momentum.
Folks, it's my job to jump in and move us to closure. So let me just take a quick moment to express my sincere thanks to our panelists for sharing their observations and experiences with us this afternoon. Clearly, these issues of access and equity, although they're profound, and we had many descriptions of how they are solvable. And they're solvable using tools and resources we already have available and ones we can invent rather easily. So from my own vantage point, watching school systems and communities and parents and students struggle with this digital divide, it certainly seems incumbent on us to advance and fully fund policies that make access not only available to every student at home, but to also, as many of our participants noted, to provide the support for educators and families so that access becomes a true benefit that supports student success. We'll try to pull together some background and information for our attendees and see how easily we can make these available and links available to participants who are part of the session today. I want to again express my sincere thanks to our panelists, our partners in support of today's event, and turn it back to President Ryan to close the session.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks again to you and others for organizing this and for asking me to participate. I want to thank the audience, especially those who asked questions, which I thought were terrific. But I mostly want to thank the panelists. This is one of the most interesting panels I've been on in a very, very long time. You enlightened us, you educated us, you inspired us, you challenged us, and you gave us ideas for what we can do to address a serious problem. And in my view, it doesn't get any better than that for a panel. So thank you. It was an honor to spend an hour with all of you.